Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana. I'm Carl Estabrook. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, March 6th, in the studios of Urbana Public Television, Urbana, Illinois. Our subject is the wars the U.S. government is waging around the world, and the racism we display to those we're killing, in accord with the Latin proverb, proprium humani ingeni est, odissi cum laesaris. It's human nature to hate those you have injured. At this moment, the U.S. is making war in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen, principally to control the flow of oil out of the Mideast and North Africa, which the U.S. uses as a weapon against its economic rivals from Germany to China. Thousands of U.S. troops are killing people in these countries, though most Americans are barely aware of it. More than 250,000 U.S. troops are stationed in 1,000 U.S. bases on foreign soil, most of them ringing Russia and China. The 70,000 members of the U.S. Special Operations Command are active in 3/4 of the countries of the world. Their activities include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. As the rest of the world recognizes, but Americans don't, they're nothing less than American death squads. The rest of the world recognizes that the U.S. today is what Martin Luther King called it long ago, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, an international criminal surpassing all others. But most Americans don't know that, protected as they are by government and media propaganda. What we do here at Aware on the Air is talk about U.S. war-making. In that regard, there were two remarkable statements this morning regarding U.S. war-making. In spite of all the U.S. warmongering versus North Korea and China, North Korea offers talks with the United States leading to its denuclearization. North Korea says that it has no need for nuclear weapons if it has a security guarantee, a guarantee that the U.S. will not attack it. North Korea says it'll halt nuclear and missile tests while the talks go on. These are talks that have been arranged by the South Korean government. Quite a remarkable turnaround from the saber rattling we were hearing from the American government just recently. Secondly, and almost more surprisingly perhaps, the U.S. establishment in the ridiculous person of the former UN ambassador Samantha Power asserts that the Italian electorate's rejection of neoliberalism, there was a big election in Italy yesterday, and the neoliberal parties, have a word more to say about that later, they lost, they were defeated. Samantha Power, remarkably enough, says that the loss is a result of, wait for it, Russian interference, Russian meddling in the Italian election. Now, this is outrageous on a number of scores, and it says nothing, of course, about what the real sources of quite remarkable turnaround by the Italian electorate was. But the ludicrous Samantha Power blames Russia for the anti-establishment success in Italy's election. If you want a thumbnail account, an accurate one, of what happened in Italy, I recommend Pepe Escobar's article, which I will place on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air. Most of the accounts of the election you get in the mainstream media are remarkably one-sided, if not as silly as Samantha Power's. They go in that direction. What happened, roughly, in Italy was an unlikely alliance between populist and nationalist parties. A nationalist party called the Lega prevailed in the north of Italy, and a populist party called the Five Star Movement prevailed in the rest of Italy. And this was unlooked for because the standard parties, the equivalent of the Republicans and the Democrats, they were essentially defeated. And this came as quite a surprise. The populist movement is called the Five-Star Movement, and the 5 stars represent the party's 5 core values, which are interesting. The 5 values of the triumphant Five-Star Movement are: 1, public water access; 2, sustainable transportation; 3, sustainable development; 4, a right to internet access; and 5, environmentalism. In foreign policy, the Five-Star Movement has disapproved the military interventions of the West, West, of course, being the U.S. and the NATO armies, in the greater Middle East, in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya. The party is against those invasions by the U.S., and it's against any notion of American further involvement in Syria. This is an aspect of the election that's not being reported much in this country, but in fact, both of the parties that triumph in this election, the Nationalist Party and what we might call the Populist Party, are anti-war. They're against the austerity that the European Union has imposed on Italy and the rest of Europe, and they're against the militarization that the U.S. imposes on Europe by way of NATO. The word populism has been thrown around a lot in recent discussion, and it seems to me that if we're going to straighten out the various views of political parties, both here and in Europe, we probably have to get away from the easy left-right distinction, which not just Donald Trump has knocked into a cocked hat. The left-right distinction doesn't mean a whole lot, but populism is used both with praise and blame in a lot of places. The best short definition I've seen of populism comes from a couple of political scientists who occasionally get something right, and they refer to it as an ideology that, quote, pits a virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice, close quote. Now, if you think about populism in those terms, it becomes clear that both the Bernie Sanders campaign in the last presidential election and the Trump campaign are both populist campaigns, because they start with the notion of a virtuous and homogeneous people set against a set of elites who are preventing those people from prospering. That brought Bernie votes, and that made Trump president. If we begin to treat populism in that way, we may come closer to understanding something about what's going on. A populist party and a nationalist party, one in Italy, and a nationalist party in this sense doesn't refer to a militarist party, just the opposite. A nationalist party in this sense is a party that says we have to take care of our own citizens. The nationalist line was sounded in the last election by that part of the Trump campaign that said we have got to stop sending jobs abroad. We have to bring jobs home to American citizens. It was in that sense nationalist, sometimes referred to as economically nationalist, and that describes also the Lega party, the other party that triumphed in Sunday's elections in Italy. What we are seeing here is a wave of populist victories. Sanders, Trump, Brexit in England was also a populist victory. The anti-establishment parties in France and Germany are also populist in that sense, and have a direct bearing on the willingness of all of these countries to fall in with American war plans versus Russia and China. So it's an important development, a development that should be paid attention to, and is not being very well reported, not accidentally, by mainstream media. You're watching Aware on the Air. We talk about American war making particularly, and I want to turn to another election, not in faraway Italy now, but here at home. I want to talk about war and the local primary election 2 weeks from today. On March 20th, there are Republican and Democratic primaries in this state for the fall elections, and the possibility of voting early is actually there now, but the actual election is, as I say, in 2 weeks on March 20th. There's in fact only one way to vote against the wars and war provocations the U.S. is conducting around the world in the local primary on March 20th. There's only one candidate who's talking that way. You can vote for the Democrat, David Gill, the only candidate in the election who calls for an end to U.S. war making. David Gill is running for the Democratic Party's nomination for the seat in the House of Representatives presently occupied by Republican Rodney Davis. That's the Illinois Congressional District 13. That's the district we live in, and we send a representative to the Congress, the House of Representatives. The representative we're currently sending is Rodney Davis. So the Democrats are holding a primary to find a candidate to run against Rodney Davis. There's only one, as I say, who is anti-war, and that's David Gill. His opponents in the Democratic primary include Betsy Londrigan, a former staffer for Senator Dick Durbin, Eric Jones, a former Illinois Assistant Attorney General, and Jonathan Abel, a college teacher and former U.S. Navy intelligence officer. The Congressman Davis supports the wars the U.S. conducting around the world, as do his putative Democratic opponents, with the exception of David Gill, the only one to answer yes to my question, should U.S. troops and weapons be brought home from the Mideast and North Africa? This was at a candidates forum a week or so ago. At this candidates forum, sponsored by the Champaign County Young Democrats, all the other candidates answered no. These troops and weapons should not be brought home. Abel, in particular, who boasts of his service, in inverted commas, as a military officer from Yugoslavia to the Mideast, where the U.S. has prosecuted criminal wars since the Clinton administration. A friend reports that at another Democratic Party 13th Congressional Candidate Forum, this one at the Plumbers Pipefitters Union Hall, quote, Gill not once but twice, in response to two different questions, spoke out against the U.S. imperial wars by tying them to draining our economy, which prevents us from having free college tuition, and Medicare for all. Of course, the other three candidates were silent on that account. The other three Democratic candidates support the American war policy. David Johnson, our friend and host of the excellent World Labor Hour on WRFU, notes that, quote, currently Gill is neck to neck in the polls for first place at 40% each with Betsy Drux and Londrigan, which is difficult to believe, he writes, if you've ever seen her speak in the blatant neoliberal position she supports. Abel is in last place with 7%, and Jones, the sneaky neoliberal who tries to come across as, oh shucks, I'm just an ordinary guy from a small town, in second to last at 14%, despite Jones having 10 times more money than all of the other candidates, $250,000, according to the website opensecrets.org. Close quote. The current administration inherits 8 wars from the previous ones, as I mentioned before. One of the candidates in the March 20th primary opposes those wars. None of the others do. And that one is David Gill, and we here at Aware on the Air think that voters should be aware of this fundamental difference, because the war issue is extremely important in these elections, even though it's not talked about. You're watching Aware on the Air. We talk about U.S. war making, and I thought of it in response to the Academy Awards over the weekend. I don't know if you watch the Academy Awards show. I could watch about half of it, but it had features of interest. I thought, for example, that The film called Three Billboards should have won the Best Picture. I particularly like that picture, and I didn't particularly like most of the others. But I thought of the picture when I was preparing today's program, because the program is based in some ways on three speeches. Speeches by the three leaders of the U.S., Russia, and China. That's President Xi of China, President Putin of Russia, and President Trump of the U.S. They all gave important speeches in the last month that affects directly our understanding of what these countries are doing in regard to war. President Xi's speech was at the Communist Party conference. The speech lasted some 3 hours. It was about as detailed as could be. President Putin's Russia speech was a regular, organized State of the Nation speech, comparable to an American president's State of the Union speech, and lasted 2 hours. President Trump's speech was a 90-minute monologue at the Gridiron Dinner, a collection of correspondence that is supposedly humorous. After reading these speeches and thinking about the discussions that they offered, I was reminded of an old line about the three famous Sung sisters in early 20th century China. It was said of them, they married into the political and social milieu of revolutionary China in the first half of the 20th century. It was said of the three Sung sisters, one loved money, one loved power, and one loved China. And I was wondering if you applied that to Trump, Putin, and Xi, which one loved money, which one loved power, and which one loved their country? The first sister, eldest sister, married to the richest man in China, H.H. Kung. The second sister married Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China and the first president of the Republic of China. And the third, the youngest sister, was a prominent political leader in her own right, the wife and partner in power of Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Kuomintang, commander-in-chief of the Chinese armies, and later president of the Republic of China. You can sort out which one loved money, which one loved power, and which one loved China. The three presidents of the contemporary political powers may be described in the same way, and one would be repaid by reading the detailed accounts that President Xi and President Putin gave of their political and military situation as it exists today. President Trump's speech was a little different. This was a comment, a set of comments to reporters at the Gridiron Dinner in Washington last week that has a tradition of being both political and humorous. And Trump said at the beginning, "My staff was concerned that I couldn't do self-deprecating humor. And I told them not to worry. Nobody does self-deprecating humor better than I do." That set the tone for an interesting set of comments. For example, he said about Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who recused himself from the Russian investigation that's ongoing still, the Russiagate nonsense in Washington. Trump said, "I offered Sessions a ride over, but he recused himself." What are you going to do? That's okay, he says. He refers to the New York Times reporters being in the room. He says, "You, the New York Times, are an icon. I'm a New York icon. You're a New York icon. And the only difference is I still own my buildings." The New York Times, as you know, is publishing things saying that Trump is Putin's puppet and is refusing to launch military action against Russia as he should do because of the meddling that Russia has supposedly done in the American presidential election. This is the background of some of the talk of impeachment of President Trump. And he says, lately, Vice President Pence has been showing a particular keen interest in the news. He started out each morning asking everyone, has he been impeached yet? Mike, you can't be impeached when there's no crime. Please remember that, says Trump. On Kim Jong-un, the president of North Korea, Trump said, I won't rule out direct talks with Kim Jong-un. I just won't. As far as the risk of dealing with a madman is concerned, that's his problem, not mine. It's his problem. Now, that maybe counts as self-deprecating humor. On his son-in-law's security clearance, but he said, before I get started, I want to apologize for arriving a little bit late. You know, we're late tonight because Jared could not get through security. He says, it might be hard for you to believe, but I do love gatherings like these. They give you a chance to socialize with members of the opposition party. It's very important. Oh, and it's also great to see some Democrats here. The suggestion being that the opposition party to the Trump administration right now is the Republicans, and there's certainly some truth in that. He took aim at his former advisor, Steve Bannon, joking that CNN had lost its very best reporter in Bannon. Quote, that guy leaked more than the Titanic, Trump said of his former chief strategist, who he criticized for speaking to Fire and Fury author Michael Wolff. There were serious things in Trump's speech, including a suggestion that Tillerson should smoke a peace pipe with the North Koreans. And that actually has paid off this week, as the South Koreans have arranged for the North Koreans to agree with talks with the United States and the suspension of their nuclear tests while those talks go on. Trump compares being president to hosting The Apprentice. The Apprentice was a television show that he hosted for a long time. He says, in one job, I had to manage a cutthroat cast of characters desperate for TV time, totally unprepared for their roles and their jobs, and each week afraid of having their asses fired. And the other job, I was the host of a smash television hit. Interesting description of his current job. And he did end with a joke directed to the reporters in the room. I just want to say this is one of the best times I've had with the media. This might be the most fun I've had since watching your faces on election night. Close quote. So, speeches from the presidents, and they may have, in spite of their different forms, some corresponding significance. There are serious issues out there that all three presidents are dealing with, most notably perhaps this week, as well as the Korean situation, the war in Syria. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated on Monday that the United States is still trying to break up Syria. According to the Russian diplomat, there's growing evidence that the U.S. and several of its allies had plans to divide the war-struck country. Now, the U.S. has been trying to overthrow the government of Syria since the Obama administration began to subvert it. Well, actually, when that began is hard to say. But when the Obama administration sent terrorists into Syria from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and elsewhere, attempting to overthrow the government of Syria because the U.S. wants a pliable regime in Damascus so that its concern for controlling the oil flows from the Middle East are not impeded. The vicious war in Syria, encouraged by the Obama administration, was inherited by the Trump administration, and it continues apparently under what is being called Plan B, the attempt to break up Syria, since it looks like the plan to overthrow President Assad of Syria, which the Obama administration followed for so long, was not going to be successful. Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia said, More and more information that we receive from a wide variety of sources indicates that a narrow, non-inclusive group formed by the Americans on Syrian issues is nurturing plans for the collapse of the Syrian state. That is, for the division, the balkanization, you might say, of Syria. The minister added that Moscow regrets the fact that not all Western countries are ready to behave honestly in regard to the current state of affairs in Syria. Lavrov's remarks come after United States Donald Trump and British Prime Minister Theresa May talked over the phone and agreed last Sunday that Russia and Syria are to blame for the heartbreaking human suffering, their phrase, in the Syrian rebel-held Eastern Ghouta. Eastern Ghouta, which you've been hearing about on the mainstream media, is a large section east of the capital city of Damascus that is held by the terrorists. It is held by the jihadists that the U.S. had been supporting in the region, and is still held by them, even though the Syrian government has regained control of a good bit of the country. As Syrian government forces, President Assad's forces, battle the group that now calls itself Jaish al-Islam, which is essentially Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group having gone through various transformations and name changes. As Syrian government forces battle Al-Qaeda to retake Eastern Ghouta, Western media outlets have totally ignored the atrocities of the insurgents, the people who are holding this territory, the terrorists, preferring to blame all the violence on the regime, as they say. The regime is the Western political description of the Assad government, the legitimate government of Syria. They're at it again, howling about a town in Syria that's been retaken by the government, that's being retaken by the government. This time it's Eastern Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus and one of the last remaining strongholds of the Islamist insurgency that has torn the country apart over the last 7 years. Before Eastern Ghouta, it was Aleppo, and before Aleppo, it was Madea, and before Madea, it was Homs, and so on. All of these places were framed as though there were no armed insurgents present, and the Syrian authorities were just mercilessly massacring civilians and of cartoonishly villainous bloodlust. If the insurgents were mentioned, they were usually, and still are, presented by the Western press as moderate rebels and freedom fighters. So if your only understanding of Eastern Ghouta comes from the mainstream media, then you're left with the impression that there's a one-sided conflict taking place between the Syrian government and its civilians. But this war isn't so simple. The rebels in charge of Eastern Ghouta are a collection of jihadist groups, the strongest of which is Jaish al-Islam, or the Army of Islam, a Salafi jihadist group backed by Saudi Arabia that seeks to replace the Syrian government with an Islamic state. Jaish al-Islam is extremely sectarian and just as nasty in its rhetoric, tactics, and goals as ISIS, the Islamic State. It engages in public executions and has publicly bragged about parading caged civilians from the minority Alawite sect in the streets as human shields. The group's founder, the late Zaran al-Aloush, openly called for the ethnic cleansing of religious minorities from Damascus. The present Damascus regime is multicultural and multi-religious, and that, to the jihadists, is unacceptable. The second largest group is holding this region outside of Damascus is Falak al-Rahman, which is allied with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, the latest name for Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate. HTS also has a small presence in Eastern Ghouta, as well as Ahrar al-Sham and Noor al-Din al-Zanki, former recipients of U.S. weapons, whose fighters videotaped themselves beheading a teenage boy. The tape is actually around, horrible as it is. These are the people the Obama administration was sending weapons to. Most recently, civilians fleeing Eastern Ghouta have described being fired on by militants seeking to prevent them from escaping to the safety of government-controlled territory, another fact that Western media outlets refuse to report. Reports that insurgents were withholding food and humanitarian aid from civilians have similarly been ignored by mainstream media. Syria is perhaps the most heavily propagandized civil war in history. Tens of millions of dollars have been spent by Western governments and their regional allies building a media apparatus that sanitizes the insurgency, blames all of the violence on the government, and agitates for more forceful Western military intervention against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. And Western media outlets have come to rely on these propaganda sources for information about the conflict and report it to you in mainstream media. The most famous is the White Helmets, a rescue group heavily funded by the US and UK governments. Marketed by a top PR firm, the White Helmets openly advocate for regime change while working alongside al-Qaeda-linked rebels in opposition areas. Some of its members have participated in atrocities on video, a fact almost entirely ignored by Western media, which is enamored with the group. The other go-to source for Western media outlets is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a monitoring organization that is run by one man working from his house in Britain who is openly biased towards the opposition. Western media also frequently relies on the self-described media activists in areas of Syria controlled by militant groups. But these groups don't tolerate activism or journalism. In fact, they're known to jail, torture, and summarily execute activists, lawyers, humanitarian workers, journalists, and minorities. That's why Western journalists can't travel to insurgent-held areas of Syria, because they're likely to be kidnapped, ransomed, or killed. This should raise serious questions about anyone purporting to be an independent source of information from inside insurgent-held Syria, because it's impossible for people to put out information without the permission of the jihadist authorities who have an interest in promoting a narrative that provokes outrage and spurs intervention. This is especially true in eastern Ghouta, where insurgents are currently losing ground. The only thing that can save Jaish al-Islam from defeat is outside intervention. Of course, information coming from government areas should also be treated with skepticism, because after all, governments also lie. But in the case of Syria, the Western press already treats media reports out of Syrian government areas as if they're all made up, while unquestionably regurgitating whatever the insurgents say is fact. Meanwhile, the media totally ignores victims in the government areas. For years, insurgents in eastern Ghouta have terrorized and killed thousands of civilians living in Damascus, which you almost never hear about in the West. Instead, mainstream outlets are busy crying out for the West to do something. All that brings us to one of the Western media's most pernicious lies, how Western inaction allowed the bloodshed in Syria to continue with impunity. But the West has intervened in Syria, and by doing so, it prolonged the slaughter and empowered al-Qaeda. Despite being warned as early as November 2011 that the armed opposition was dominated by violent sectarian extremists, the Obama administration spent $1 billion a year training and funneling weapons to an insurgency they knew was linked to al-Qaeda in order to overthrow the Syrian government. Al-Qaeda has built its largest affiliate in history as a direct result of this reckless U.S. regime change policy. In other words, the U.S. government outsourced its war on Syria to al-Qaeda death squads, and Americans have no idea because Western media continue to promote lies about the West's so-called inaction. This is not about glorifying the Syrian government, which is indeed authoritarian and extremely flawed. It's about what would have replaced the government had it collapsed. The alternative was unacceptable to most Syrians. That's why the vast majority of Syrians, at least 75% as of 2016, a number that's certainly higher today as the government has recaptured vast swaths of territory from insurgents, live in government-controlled areas. In fact, millions fled to the safety of government-controlled cities after insurgents violently captured their areas to escape the criminal behavior of the armed insurgents. Others fled because they feared the government bombing the extremist group invited when they entered. To really understand the severity of what the U.S. did in Syria, let's put it in the American context. It would be the equivalent of America's adversaries funding and arming the KKK to invade and occupy cities in the U.S. and the media then describing the KKK militias as moderate rebels and freedom fighters as they kill minorities and shell civilians in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles. Imagine how Washington might react in such a scenario. Well, actually, you don't have to imagine. Look no further than their global killing spree after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, which ironically enough created the al-Qaeda threat in the Middle East to begin with. And then there's the massive double standard at play. After ISIS captured large swaths of territory in Iraq, the Iraqi government, with American air support, launched a series of operations to retake cities like Mosul and Fallujah and Tikrit, which the Western press almost always celebrated as liberation. Meanwhile, in Syria, the Syrian government, with Russian air support, had used many of the same military tactics to retake cities like Aleppo and eastern Ghouta from groups no different from ISIS, yet the media has framed those operations as heinous acts that amount to genocide. The conflict in Syria might be a confusing and complicated mess, but as the howls from the mainstream press for the West to do something grow louder, it's important to stay mindful of the fact that there's an agenda behind their one-sided version of reality, and that agenda is support the American attempt to overthrow the government of Syria using terrorists, jihadists as their weapon to do that. You're listening to Aware on the Air. We are coming to the end of the time we have set aside for this program. And I'm thinking that I will turn it over to our excellent director and producer to run two clips that are occasioned by the meeting of AIPAC in Washington going on currently. AIPAC is the Israeli propaganda front in the U.S., the American Israeli Political Action Committee, and the president and the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in town for the occasion, and we have some comments on that coming up. You have been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 10th week of 2018. Another week in which the world can see that the most extensive global terrorism is U.S. worldwide war-making. My thanks tonight, as usual, to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson for research. See No's notes on the Facebook page for Aware on the Air, along with other articles referred to tonight, and other things, including Nicholas Baker's excellent Why I Am a Pacifist, The Myth of the Good War. And we will, as I say, conclude tonight with two pieces from the Real News Network, in the midst of the AIPAC conference in D.C. The first is the U.S. ramping up its military presence in Syria and planning to attack Iran. And then secondly, Netanyahu or not, Israel is corrupted. These two pieces will follow on and be available on YouTube. I also want to announce that Aware will meet this Sunday. We have regular weekly meetings on Sunday evening from 5 to 6 p.m. But this Sunday, the meeting will be at the Hammerhead Coffee Shop in Campustown, 608 East University Avenue, 5 p.m. this coming Sunday. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others, truth-tellers persecuted by the U.S. government. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Green, Ed Mandel, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson is up next, and his bio is incredibly long, and he has a lot to talk about, so I'm going to shorten it. He is going to talk about is the U.S. ramping up its military presence in Syria and preparing to attack Iran for Israel. And his last position in the government was as Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff from 2002 to 2005. And before serving, okay, I'm really shortening it. Before serving at the State Department, Wilkerson served 31 years in the U.S. Army, and he retired from active service in 1997 as a colonel and has taught national security affairs in the honors program at George Washington University, and you're currently distinguished visiting professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, and you're working on a book about the first George Bush administration. Welcome.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm the last speaker. I get that distinction. If this were a military audience, I'd ask you to stand up and do 5 minutes of calisthenics just to make sure you don't doze off. I have to identify myself with the remarks that were just made. Over some 400 students, graduate and undergraduate, and 12 years on 2 university campuses, and 6 years with about 1,000 students at 2 of the nation's most prestigious war colleges. We have determined, although it would be probably difficult to prove, and that's the reason we have covert operations, that Lyndon Johnson not only knew the gory details of the Israeli attack on USS Liberty in the Eastern Mediterranean, he also knew about what was just told you. That is to say, he knew the uranium was being diverted, he knew Israel was building a bomb, and he chose not to do anything about it. That's not my subject today, although I could talk on that sort of thing forever, as I'm sure Jefferson could too. These days, I believe one gets the best insights into Israeli security policy, and perhaps even into Israeli policy writ large, which you've heard a lot about today, from the Russian emigre to Israel, a former foreign minister, and now its defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman. Whether it's his calling Arab members of the Knesset war criminals, or declaring the Jewish people should leave France, or claiming that the next military action against Hamas in Gaza will be the last, or contradicting his own military chief by denying there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, or stating categorically that the IDF will stop at nothing in order to win, reminding me a great deal of Dick Cheney, Lieberman is the living face of Bibi Netanyahu's Zionist policies. I sometimes think he would have rather remained in Russia so long as it was the Soviet Union and so long as he were in a significant position of power there. In addition to reminding me of Cheney, he is reminiscent of, and indeed might well be a latent version of, Joseph Stalin. As an aside, it is intriguing, and I think well outside the usual conspiracy theory, to consider whether or not Lieberman has been intimated of our own President Trump might be an NKVD, GRU, KGB, FSB, you name it, plant. That is an agent of Vladimir Putin. He has more or less forged most of the 1 million Russian emigres since 1991 into a formidable political force, forming the political party that has more than once played kingmaker in the Israeli political scene. What a strategic coup for Vladimir, the master chess player in the world today, in my estimation, while everyone else plays a really lousy game of checkers. It would be quite a coup for him. Of far more concern at the moment and readily provable, unlike what I just said, Lieberman exemplifies where Israel is headed, toward a massive confrontation with the various powers arrayed against it, a confrontation that will suck America in and perhaps terminate the experiment that is Israel and do irreparable damage to the empire that America has become. Lieberman will speak in April in New York City at the annual conference of the Jerusalem Post. The title is, quote, "The New War with Iran," unquote. It is clear that he's in the forefront of promoting this war. And nowhere does my concern about such a war focus more acutely at the moment than in Syria. As President of France, Emmanuel Macron described it recently, quote, "The current rhetoric of the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel is pushing the region toward conflict with Iran," unquote. In that triad, no state is doing that more than Israel. Listen to Netanyahu in January at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem. Quote, "The greatest danger that we face of hatred for the Jewish people and the Jewish state comes from Iran. It comes from the Ayatollah regime that is fanning the flames of anti-Semitism," unquote. This anti-Semitism bit, of course, as we've heard today, almost always a weapon of choice for Israeli politicians under stress, hurled in this case at the country whose Jewish population, by the way, the largest in the Middle East outside Turkey and Israel, lives in Iran in reasonable peace. And don't forget that these words are uttered by the man who is, as we've heard here today briefly, doing everything he can to expel dark-skinned African refugees, largely from Eritrea and the Sudan, from Israel, where most have come as legitimate refugees. President Trump's wall on the Mexican border is nothing compared to Bibi's actual policies. More recently, Bibi's performance at the Munich Security Conference bordered on the infantile, and yet effective when you think about the audience to whom he's speaking, as he held aloft an alleged piece on an alleged Iranian drone and asked Monsieur Zarif if he recognized it. Of course, Mr. Zarif later took his occasion at the microphone to characterize Netanyahu's performance as like that of a circus clown. Pretty good characterization, as a matter of fact. But I like the comment of Lebanon's defense minister, even better. It went to the point. He said that he had an Israeli drone over his head virtually 24/7. That comment put the hypocrite that Netanyahu is in the right perspective. Of late, of course, Tel Aviv is increasingly using Iran's presence in Syria, its support for President Bashar al-Assad, and its alleged drive, and I love this one, my military comrades love it too, for a Shia corridor from Tehran to Aden as the hoary beast that must not be at any cost, including, of course, American treasure and lives, as his probable cause and existential prompt for action. That Israel has in support such disparate figures as Nikki Haley at the United Nations, Jim Mattis at the Pentagon, Rex Tillerson at State, as well as the usual suspects from outside the world of warmed-over neoconservatives, is indicative of such policy. But it's not just the usual suspects from the world of neocons, about whom I know quite a bit, having experienced them in 2001 and 2 and 3. Take, for example, my fellow South Carolinian, Lindsey Graham, speaking 4 days ago after a breathless trip to Israel, a bipartisan trip, he called it. I don't know how anybody could use that term. And I caution, don't laugh, because Lindsey was serious, I think, but anything bipartisan with regard to Israel, call it unanimity. Call it absolute unanimity, anything but bipartisan. In fact, the proper words are probably overwhelming and an unprecedented unanimity. In fact, the only issue that does unify the United States Congress, other than mom and apple pie. But Graham had this to say, quote, "Anytime you leave a meeting where the request is ammunition, 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 that's probably not good." That's Lindsey. That's Lindsey. I know Lindsey well. "This was the most unnerving trip I've had in a while," he said breathlessly again. Graham went on to assert that, quote, when they tell you we won't help to deal with the blowback that might come from attacks on civilian targets, where Hezbollah has integrated military capability, that was so striking. That was striking," end of quote. And then Senator Coons, who up until this time I've had some respect for, fairly sane and sober senator from Delaware, reported that, quote, "The tempo in terms of potential for conflict in Syria has gone up astronomically. The technologies Iran is projecting into Syria and southern Lebanon has gone up. Iran's willingness to be provocative, to push the edges of the envelope, to challenge Israel has gone up," end of quote. Coons reported this almost as breathlessly as Lindsey. With the highest tech nation on earth in Syria, the United States of America, that is all Coons could derive from his visit. That the country that spends less than 1% of what the U.S. spends on its national security, has introduced new technologies in Syria, technologies that threaten the country Israel, to whom the U.S. bounty is limitless? This is Joseph Goebbels' territory. Karl Rove is envious. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, as the heir to the Project for a New American Century, Bill Kristol's Iraq-bound think tank, leads that pack of wolves disguised as warmed-over neocons, lavishly funded by the likes of Paul Singer. It's even spawned the Institute for the Study of War, a fascinating Orwellian title. If there ever was one, it should be the Institute for War. I've been asked, why is it that you ascribe to FDD and now the ISW such nefarious motives? I was asked this by the New York Times editorial staff when they published my op-ed on Iran a few days ago. My answer is simple, because that is precisely what FDD is attempting to do. Just as Douglas Feist, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Office of Special Plans, did in 2002 and 2003 for Richard Bruce Cheney to lead us into war with Iraq. I've been there, done that. I don't need the tour. The salient question, though, why do you believe that America is headed for a struggle with Iran, needs an answer. Certainly, America's unquestioning support is required, as has been the case from George W. Bush to Barack Obama to the rapture-seeking Mike Pence and the tweeter-and king Donald Trump. But it seems that recently, Lieberman and Netanyahu and their acolytes in this country, amongst which I put at the top Nikki Haley, have determined that it would be best if American troops also participated in the overthrow of the Tehran regime. From one point of view, I suppose this is understandable, the crassly opportunistic point of view, that is, that better to squander your own allies' blood and treasure than your own, but it's certainly not in the character that I'm used to with regard to the state of Israel, and certainly not with regard to the Israeli Defense Force. That force could handle anything Iran threw at it militarily is undeniable. Any military professional will tell you that. And that Israel's more than 200 nuclear warheads could decimate Iran is equally undeniable. So why this attempt to suck America into this conflict? I believe the answer is fairly clear once you push aside the cobwebs that surround it. The legitimacy of great power is what I call it, and that is precisely what Netanyahu and Lieberman desire. It's also what Riyadh desires, especially with the new boy king, Mohammed bin Salman, now an erstwhile ally of Israel. In short, the IDF could defend Israel, but it could not attack Iran, not successfully anyway. And were it to do so, it would be damned internationally and thus isolated even more than it already is today, perhaps devastatingly so. But America, already damned by well more than half the world, polls show at least 4 billion people think we're the #1 threat to their security in the world. Think about that for a minute. We've already done Iraq, Libya, and Syria. Afghanistan would just be seen as continuing the trend. Besides, America has the military capacity, and here's the long pole in the tent, to project the power needed to unseat swiftly the regime in Tehran. Swiftly in terms of Saddam Hussein, for example, not swiftly in terms of taking care of 75 million people, each one of which in a very rugged and strategically deep terrain would want to kill every damned American in the country, along with probably half the rest of the Arabs in the area. So, there's only one significant hang-up that I see with this strategy that Netanyahu and Lieberman are pushing. Embroiled in his own legal problems that just might send him to jail, as such problems would likely have sent Ariel Sharon to jail had he not been in really bad shape at the end of his prime ministership, they're both headed for war. Of that, I'm convinced. They will use Iran's allegedly existential to Israel presence in Syria, which is becoming even more so from a military perspective every day, Hezbollah's accumulation of some 150,000 missiles, if we believe our intelligence agencies, the need to set Lebanon's economy back, yet again, that's important. Look at what they're deliberating right now with regard to the new, very, very rich gas find in the eastern Mediterranean, with Israel claiming Section 9 and Lebanon claiming Section 9. Take that, Lebanon, we're going to bomb you, then you'll let us have it. And that will be their excuse. And we're looking at them taking on, and this is a point that all military people understand, a country that couldn't beat Iraq in 8 years of brutal, bloody war. An Iraq that we beat in 19 days. So this is the colossal threat that they're up against. And men such as H.R. McMaster are helping them. The much heralded author of Dereliction of Duty, great title, and a man who knows about as much about Iran as I do about the 8th planet in the 95th solar system in the 50th galaxy past our own. And here's a hope I have. Let's hope that the chess master in chief, old Vladimir Putin, he that ruins elections from Paris to Peoria, is smart enough, once again, not to let this happen. I fear he'll not be, and we might have the stirrings of 1914, as utterly stupid as we now know those stirrings to have been. People to whom I mention such possibilities, people who are critically analytical and normally fairly sound in their thinking, respond that, well, don't you consider that sort of dreary prognosis a little bit overdrawn? My rejoinder is usually something a bit too clever, perhaps, but along these lines, don't you think a number of people said that in the summer of 1914? They respond, but have we not learned so much since then? I'll let you be the judge of that and inform you only that in my considered view, we have learned very little, and there are the ingredients right now with Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, losing dramatically in Yemen right now, and the United States and Russia at the peak of all of this to get engaged. A very distinct possibility. I looked at this from the perspective of the political parameters. What is it that we're confronting today in this country? And this took me down an entirely different path as I tried to figure out just how this team of McMaster, Tillerson, Kelly, et al., and Trump at the top of it, will face this sort of decision-making process. And the only place I could find that remotely resembled where we are today in our past was the period 1850 to 1860. And so about 6 months ago, I started reading as voraciously as I could on that period. I'd done some reading, but I needed to really do a lot more. It is stunning, the similarities between that period and now, particularly in the political situation where one side of the country wouldn't talk to the other side of the country, and vice versa. And I was struck today by some of the comments that were made that resemble the comments that were made by my region. My state fired on Fort Sumter, after all, back in those days. And if that is the political situation in which this government will do its national security decision-making, then we are in deeper trouble than even the prospects of a region-wide and perhaps even bigger war in the Middle East. And the country that will have started it all, the relationship, unbalanced as it is, that will have made it possible, is Israel. And that's the danger we face.